Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. With the events in Afghanistan, including the fall of the Ghani government, much speculation and much ink has been spilled over the question of what went wrong on the U.S. withdrawal and what this means for the future of U.S. policy. But much less ink has been spilled about what it means for the future of Afghanistan. Our guests today are here to talk about that. We have a guest who's an expert in the question of recognition of governments and a guest who's an expert in non-state armed groups. And between them, we hope to shed some light on what the future of governance looks like in Afghanistan. And without further ado, I'll turn over to our guests to introduce themselves. Vanda, could you start?
Hello, I am Vanda Felbab-Brown, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I direct the Initiative on Nonstate Armed Actors.
Scott?
My name is Scott R. Anderson. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution as well in the Governance Studies program. I'm also a senior fellow with the National Security Law program at Columbia Law School. And then I am a senior editor and general counsel for the publication Lawfare, a sister publication, a fellow traveler of War on the Rocks in many ways.
Indeed. And I would commend to our listeners, if you haven't had an opportunity, Scott had an excellent piece recently in Lawfare on the question of recognition of the Taliban government. And Vanda has an excellent piece up on the Brookings Institution website looking at the prospects for success or stability for a Taliban government. And so if you find your interest piqued by our discussion, you can go find more of these scholars' works at their home institution there in a way that I think is very useful. Vanda, if I could start the discussion with you, as someone who studies non-state armed groups for a living, what are some of the challenges that these groups face when they move from the status of spoiler or insurgent or rebels to a group that's attempting to govern within the state that they've been fighting?
Well, in general, it is much easier being an insurgent or revolutionary than being a governor. For one, if you are a revolutionary, obviously you need to manage the military side of the conflict, but essentially you just need to point out all the deficiencies of the government, from its corruption to its inadequate policies. And you have to really deliver some governance, but at a much smaller scale with far greater limits than if you are actually now the governor. The Taliban is an extraordinarily competent, sophisticated and successful insurgency. It survived several decades. It survived 2 decades of being pounded by the United States and NATO. It avoided splits. It managed its different factions to remain cohesive. But it's still nonetheless very unprepared to be running a country like Afghanistan, a country in the 21st century. And all the issues in which it excelled in its shadow governance, such as delivering order, a brutal but predictable order, and not being corrupt, delivering effective dispute resolution mechanisms, will only get it so far in governing a country. It has no knowledge of macroeconomic policies, it has no knowledge of complex policy issues, and they will immediately be an immense challenge for the Taliban.
I was kind of curious about that aspect because, it strikes me that in some ways, while the ideology is very different, the Taliban has had some elements of a classic Maoist insurgency in terms of trying to replace governmental function with their own form. But as you say, there's certain aspects that are pretty much uniquely the province of the government. But I'm curious, in your studies, have you seen any difference in the success in transitioning to governance between groups that have taken that type of approach as opposed to a group that takes perhaps a more rapid, a Cheist approach or something like that? Are they better positioned to do so? Have they developed people with those skill sets?
Well, we have frankly seen really very few groups that manage to make the transition from insurgency to, first of all, winning the war, and second, to then remaining in power. So if you don't go as far back as Mao, look at more recent history, it would be the Maoists in Nepal, and they managed to become a political party and a governing entity that is as ineffective in managing Nepal as other parties like the National Congress are, but a key element of nonetheless becoming a viable governing entity has been that the Maoists in Nepal have become good communists, rather good capitalists, despite their credentials. Another group that we can look at recent history was Al-Shabaab, when they managed to come to power in 2009, and they lost the rule within 2 years. For many reasons, including because they mismanaged its relations with external actors, and internally as well, were really excruciatingly incompetent in delivering any kind of modicum of economic policies. And so those some of the same issues, the economy, managing armed opposition, preventing internal fragmentation, managing external relations, and delivering services will be the same problems and, frankly, excruciating challenges for the Taliban. And the group might find itself that despite its accomplishment and the triumph that the Taliban now feels, it was far comfortable being an insurgency than it is being a government.
So how much of a difference does it make when the armed group is recognized by other states as the legitimate government of the state in terms of their success? Does that give them a boost in some way?
Well, the external recognition certainly is very beneficial to countries. And when the Taliban was running Afghanistan from 1996 through 2001, it badly wanted international recognition, even though it really received it only three countries at the time: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Pakistan. What is even more different today, however, is the issue of 9/11 international sanctions and the financial regimes surrounding designation of groups as terrorist groups and the ability to conduct international business as a result. All this has dramatically tightened after 9/11. And so the fact that the Taliban remains a designated entity by the United States and by the United Nations means that legal, legitimate business with the group is prohibited. That has immense implication for the Taliban in its ability to lure in international investors, such as from China and Russia, countries that are well used to evading international sanctions, but nonetheless, it's still a big decision for them to decide to evade international sanctions and blatantly challenge them. But also even in very basic issues like receiving humanitarian aid. 90% of the country is in poverty, and 1/3 of the population is currently in acute food insecurity. So that's just one slip away from famine. We're talking maybe 14 million people. Without international humanitarian aid, whether through NGOs or through other countries, the Taliban has no capacity to cope with that immediate humanitarian catastrophe. And yet the sanctions make it illegal and potentially highly punishable for humanitarian NGOs or governments to engage. So clearly, one of the immediate priority issues is to think, quite apart from recognition, how will humanitarian exceptions to the sanctions be handled even before there are broader considerations of recognition.
Scott, what's your perspective on that? How much difference does recognition make for a government that aspires to transition from revolutionaries to a stable government?
So I think Vanda has it basically right here, in that the Taliban is kind of an exceptional case because of issues unrelated to recognition that bear on it. I think a lot of resistance movements, insurgent movements, non-state actors that are in the position to become the government of a state potentially really look to recognition to get a lot of real benefits to them. And that's because recognition, well, sometimes people think it's primarily a symbolic move or something that is primarily normative. It, in fact, is actually a legal determination that has real legal consequences. It essentially means that from the perspective of a foreign state, let's say the United States, you are saying, I believe this regime, in this case, the Taliban, let's say, has the legal authority to speak for and exercise the rights of the state of Afghanistan on behalf of the state of Afghanistan. And that can mean a lot of different things. It's kind of like when you see a change in corporate management at a particular corporation. A lot of the legal rights actually go with the corporation, not with the management. So in this case, the state of Afghanistan owns assets in different countries overseas. Until the Taliban is recognized as the government of Afghanistan, it can't access or control those assets in those domestic legal systems, because from the perspective of those states and their domestic legal systems, it's not the government of Afghanistan. It has no right to it any more than any other set of Afghan citizens or other non-state actors. Same goes for diplomatic properties or the right to exercise rights under treaties like the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations that govern the sending of ambassadors, the sending of envoys, the receipt of privileges and immunities that are legal protections. That might be particularly useful for groups like the Taliban, whose members are wanted criminals in a number of countries in various regards. So there are real benefits for them that arise from potentially recognition. The challenge here is that there's such a legal regime that's in place around the Taliban already that limits some of those consequences of recognition. Sanctions being the number one example. You can be a recognized government and still be subject to the same sanctions that the Taliban is and probably would be. One question that would arise is if the Taliban were viewed as responsible, recognized being responsible for the state of Afghanistan, is to say, well, what does that then do to Afghan governmental entities? Do they retain some sort of separate legal personality that is not subject to the same sanctions as the Taliban is through most of these regimes? That would be strange in the sanctions universe, where usually those sorts of aliases and close connections are seen as, at least at a minimum, prohibited by sanctions prohibitions, if not warranting the extension of the prohibition to the new entity that has such a close relationship. But you've seen some chatter in different circles about people saying, well, this is one interpretation the United States could advance to try and get around, to leave some wiggle room for humanitarian assistance, foreign assistance, some of these things that, as Vanda noted, Afghanistan's going to very badly need, but that sanctions are going to pose a major obstacle to it. I will say the one remaining benefit that the Taliban really has for recognition, there are a couple of them. I think diplomatic relations is a big one. UN representation is another one that often comes, is not necessarily tied one-to-one with recognition, but often flows from it. But one of the biggest ones for them is once they are recognized as the government of Afghanistan, that's something that tends to stick. It does not get rolled back very easily, and there can be only one. That means insofar as there are other groups contesting for the claim of the government, and we know at least the former first vice president, Saleh, has made some claims to this from the Panjshir Valley in kind of a redo of the 1990s scenario regarding the Rabbani government, where you have an ongoing claim to the legal status of the government, even though you don't really control the country anymore. There's the potential, and we've seen some members in Congress about this, that the United States or other countries might recognize them and give them access to these resources and these funds. It wouldn't be the first time something like that had happened if you think about Libya or Venezuela in the last few years. But if the Taliban is recognized first, it makes that extremely unlikely, because states simply do not reverse their recognition determination to be a clear sign that the international community, or at least those states recognize the Taliban, are not betting on those other factions. In fact, the Taliban is seen as having won the day and control the country.
So one of the things that struck me in your Lawfare piece that hadn't frankly occurred to me beforehand was that recognition, I like your point that it's not a normative assessment. It's an assessment of what group is exercising something akin to governmental control over the territory in question and thus should be recognized. But your point that it comes not only with rights, but with responsibilities. And it strikes me that there are implications under international human rights law for the way in which the Taliban addresses Afghan citizens and things like that may be more difficult to make actionable if you don't recognize them as the government. If they are simply a non-state armed group with some sort of unclear status, it may be more challenging to hold them accountable for the way in which they choose to treat their citizens. But I'm curious if you could just kind of outline for us what the sorts of considerations are that go into the decision to recognize or to not recognize a government.
Sure. It's a complicated question, in part because we've seen it change a lot over the last 100 years, certainly, really particularly over the last 40 or 50 years. The traditional standard for the recognition of a government is what's called the effective control standard. And this is a standard that really dates all the way back to the 19th century, kind of was most notably recapitulated and stated by actually Chief Justice William Howard Taft in a 1918 arbitration opinion. That's kind of defined as the Tinoco opinion. But what it essentially means is that effective control is when a regime controls the territory of a state with a degree of acquiescence of the public to the extent that it looks like it's permanent or at least substantially enduring, and in a manner that allows it to exercise its internal and external obligations, which often means kind of enforcing the rule of law. And what this boils down to basically is like it looks a lot and acts a lot like a government, and it can do all the things we expect a government being able to do in this territory of the state in regards to the population of the state. It's worth noting, it's not clear whether that has to be 100% of the state. I mean, certainly lots of states have insurrectionary movements or conflicted areas or other areas where they don't exercise what you would see as effective control. Some regimes have been recognized as a government, even where that's the case. So it's not a clear bar. It doesn't clearly have to be like an absolute 100%, but at least a substantial and usually a very high bar to say, okay, this applies to a lot of the state, certainly compared to any other competitors, potentially. And then each of these other variables is very fact-specific well. So there's a lot of flexibility based into that standard, but it's supposed to be the rubric that states are applying when they look at this and say, okay, we have to treat this entity as the government of a state. In the last 40 or 50 years, really kind of in the rise of the UN system, particularly in the kind of post-colonial era in the UN system, we've seen recognition get tied into some other more normative values as well. Almost everyone recognizes once effective control is satisfied, you have to treat that regime as the government for certain purposes. But you don't have to necessarily do everything you do for it that you do for all the other governments you fully recognize, like your allies. And that means that to get to that higher level of recognition, which is often called de jure recognition, whereas de facto recognition is kind of the strict baseline effective control standard. To get de jure recognition, states sometimes say, well, we want to see you exercise governance through democratic values, or through at least an inclusive mode of governance, or to comply with human rights values, or to apply the rule of law effectively, or sometimes with a little more naked realpolitik, to accept certain policy conditions or capitulations that we have previously negotiated or discussed with you. These are additions to this kind of standard of recognition that really muddy up state practice. It's often a little unclear or very unclear exactly where the de facto versus de jure line lies and exactly what each government is saying it understands the other regime to be able to do on behalf of the state. But the general principle is that states increasingly now tie this idea of recognition to a lot of these other normative ideas that are kind of related to the effective control standard. You noted, I think, really well, Doyle, like the tie between human rights and the ability to exercise your international legal obligations on behalf of a state. And so there you can make that argument for a lot of these conditions, but they're all just a little bit more attenuated from that core standard, and there makes it so recognition comes to be used much more as a policy tool. And then in some cases, we've seen, particularly in the last decade or two, although certainly before that too, within the United States, at least in the last decade or two, more and more cases where these standards, these ideas, sometimes even trump more effective control. So the recognition of the Juan Guaido regime in Venezuela is a case where, well, he had a legal claim to why he was president. That was credible, colorable at least, but he didn't control any of the country. And you had an existing regime that had been the recognized regime, the Maduro regime. So there's a little flexibility there. The Transitional National Council in Libya in 2011 is a similar example where the Obama administration shifted recognition away from the Gaddafi government towards the TNC, kind of in a couple of stages, but effectively recognized them as the new government in a way that allowed them to access a huge amount of Libyan assets that were in the United States, in part to help fund this opposition movement. So recognition comes to be used much more as a policy tool because of these more flexible and policy-based standards that have played a more prominent role, particularly in the last few decades.
So one of the aspects of the Taliban, and it's one of the reasons why they are under sanction and regarded by many states as a terrorist entity, has been their use of violence and a very brutal approach to suppressing those who disagree with their rule and territory that they control. And Vanda, I'm curious, based on your study, to what extent does such a reliance on violence and intimidation correlate with success or lack of success as an armed group tries to transition to exercising effective control?
I would start by pointing out that the delivery of order, even brutal order, has actually brought the Taliban considerable legitimacy in its shadow governance. So Afghan people in the 1990s and past 9/11 never liked the repression, particularly in its most egregious forms, such as executions of people in stadiums, applying very barbaric and draconian medieval kind of punishments. But the fact that the Taliban has been effective in suppressing predatory criminality has been a huge source of the Taliban's entrenchments and political capital. It's also not the sole source of its entrenchment and political capital. It got a great deal of legitimacy by sponsoring opium poppy cultivation and heroin production in Afghanistan, which until the recent days has been the principal source of employment for the country's people, along with being in the military security services in one way or another. So essentially, with some simplification, you could either have a job working in poppy or you could have a job working in the military or in the Taliban. Those two principal sources of legitimacy are wrapped around the notion of order. And they are, however, now going to be contested for the Taliban. So first of all, we already saw the attacks by the Islamic State in Khorasan, which challenge or undermine the claim that the Taliban is better able to deliver security than the government. The Taliban is now the government, and they will struggle in preventing some of the urban attacks by the Islamic State. The Islamic State is an enemy of the Taliban. They've been fighting each other with great determination. The Taliban has been very assiduous and often effective in countering the Islamic State in the rural areas. But it will now be challenged in having to deal with ISK in urban spaces, and particularly as the Islamic State has been hell-bent on starting a sectarian Sunni-Shia war in Afghanistan, something the prior leader of the Taliban, Mullah Mansour, wanted to avoid, and something that was very much associated with the Taliban in the 1990s, where the repression of the Shia communities was very strong. So here is an immediate challenge to how brutality will translate into delivery of order. I mean, the reports that we are hearing from the ground even in recent days, is that the Taliban is still getting praise for crime being down, whether it's Kunduz or Jalalabad or Kabul. Obviously, women are very afraid, and so the sense of street-level security is perceived in dramatically different ways by males than by women in Afghanistan. But this notion that both corruption is down and that order is up, that crime is down, still continues to be coming from Taliban under the recent days of the Taliban rule. And that really has been also a key hallmark of its shadow governance as well as its governance in the 1990s. In my many trips to Afghanistan over the past 20 years, I was often told the following story. We hated the Taliban. We didn't like how brutal it was. But when the Taliban was in power, we could travel with 1 million rupees. At the time in the 1990s, it was rupees, it was not Afghanis, from Kandahar to Kabul, and no one would rob us. Now with the current government, whether it was the government of Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani, we cannot travel 5 kilometers because we will be robbed, our women will be raped or kidnapped. So the brutality can be a source of legitimacy if it is well moderated and managed. And the Taliban has been capable of being responsive to local communities. That's another key reason why it has been such an effective insurgency, is that it's been able to calibrate its brutality with pushback from local communities, and has been able to sort of give up and moderate at least some dimension of its rule when the population found it too brutal and too intolerable. This is in striking difference, for example, to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Boko Haram in Nigeria, which never really handled that calibration, that input from communities, nowhere as well as the Taliban did.
I was gonna swing back to something that Scott mentioned earlier. You talked about the idea of recognition not being a purely normative choice, But to what extent does the record of a group of using these sorts of brutal control techniques, even if they do indeed bring order, make the trains run on time, to what extent does that affect the choice of whether or not to recognize a government, at least in U.S. history?
So that's a really good point. And violence has certainly played kind of a double-edged role historically, in part because of the shifts in how states approach recognition we've seen take place over the last century or two. The standard for effective control I mentioned notably uses the term acquiescence. And this is, I think, Chief Justice Taft's effort to try and capture attention here, which is that all government, if you boil it down enough, arguably comes down to the strategic application of violence. The question is, how do you align it with norms and values and other principles that might make it more or less acceptable from the perspective of particular people? And so there's always some element of violence and coercion inherent in rule of law. But at the same time, we all know, because we are fortunate enough to live in a society where that's not the reason why at least we feel like we go along with the system 90% of the time, 99% of the time, hopefully for most of us. We think there's legitimacy behind it. We have nothing else except the rules of the game and say, I don't like this policy, I don't like what's happening, but I'm part of a system that lets me argue about it and try and persuade people to change it. And that's how I get out of it. All our contestation gets channeled through particular institutional avenues that arrive at somewhere other than resistance to the status quo that the government's kind of set up for us, or that our constitutional order set up for us. I think that's what the tension that they're trying to get at here. So as Vanda noted, the fact that violence is involved isn't necessarily prohibited. Lots of very brutal regimes are and have been recognized by the United States and every other country in the world over and over again, and will continue to be moving forward. But it does play into this question of acquiescence and then the standards about the application of human rights, some of the normative standards. If they are outright brutal, unnecessarily brutal in ways that exceed the level of violence that is accepted by human rights standards, and human rights recognize the need to enforce the law and exercise force in different circumstances in order to do so, then that begins to push against that other boundary to say, well, this is just violating international human rights standards, or this is just unnecessarily brutal and cruel and is intended to intimidate people more than to secure their acquiescence through the effective administration of government. All these terms, though, they're all very subjective. They're all very fact-specific. And again, they give governments a lot of flexibility. So I think the most reliable takeaway you can take from this is that over-reliance on violence gives lots of outs by which other foreign governments will be able to say, well, we don't have to recognize you because you are just relying so heavily on violence. If they were to secure the actual popular acquiescence of the public through legitimacy or through an election even, then that's really hard to ignore. But violence has, in a way, become less and less acceptable as being a major means of securing that acquiescence that's inherently as part of the effective control standard.
And if I can come in on this question, is also the issue of what does actually the content of the use of violence means. So on the one hand, we can imagine slaughter of populations based on their ethnicity or slaughter of opposition groups. On the other hand, the violence can be more selective, even if brutal, to generate demonstrative effects. And violence can also be sort of more indirect. I mean, there is a lot of thinking, for example, in various European Union countries, that simply prohibiting women from having access outside of the household is its form of violence without the women being necessarily beaten or slaughtered. And so here, the matter of what does violence mean in a modern state, what does violence mean in a modern international society, becomes highly relevant, particularly if the number of people who are actually physically hurt or killed is not necessarily great, yet half of the population, women, are subjected to conditions that would be akin to slavery, which is what women's rights in Afghanistan were like in the 1990s, or the lack of women's rights in Afghanistan was like in the 1990s. And it's interesting in my own conversation with various Taliban interlocutors over the years, how they relate to those issues. And on the issue of women's rights, for example, they would often say, look, you United States have these great relations with Saudi Arabia. That's, of course, a mischaracterization of U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, but that's how they would portray it. Well, if the conditions for women in Afghanistan are like in Saudi Arabia, we're perfectly happy. And then how dare you tell us that we cannot have good relations with you or good economic relations, because we would be adopting essentially the same approaches. Now, we are yet to see what the conditions of women will in fact be like. I think that at the sort of best case scenario, we're looking at an Iran-like system and Iran-like opportunities and restrictions on women. And the worst case is the 1990s. At least formally, and in between is various versions of the Saudi model. But I just raised that in the complexities of the Afghanistan case, not just related to exercise of violence as in killing and torture, but also as in restrictions for half of the population, in this case, women.
So it occurs to me, so many of the examples that we access stem from the period of time when the Taliban was in power in Afghanistan, and as examples of the way in which we expect them to rule. And yet the intervening 20, 25 years have not been a healthy time if you have been a Taliban leader. It has been, A, the passage of time, B, a concentrated effort by U.S. and NATO forces to kill leadership in the Taliban organization. And I'm curious, how much continuity have you seen in the Taliban from this period of their rule through today, both in terms of personnel, but also in terms of outlook and objectives?
It's an excellent question, Doyle, and I think that it's a question that many of us are dealing with, trying to parse out. There are several important differences, one of which is that the Taliban today is less united than it was in the 1990s. I mentioned that it's been a very effective insurgency because it has managed up till now to bridge the highly disparate policy views, highly disparate outlooks, great diversity of how inward or outward a group is, how focused on economic issues versus religious issues the different factions are. And interestingly enough, some of the older leadership that's still surviving today, most prominently represented by Mullah Baradar, that experienced rule in the 1990s, was part of the rule in the 1990s, often tends to be more moderate, tends to be also more responsive to issues of terrorism not leaking out of Afghanistan, having experienced the unraveling of the Taliban rule as a result of tacit acquiescence to al-Qaeda activities in Afghanistan in the 1990s. Interestingly enough, many of the military commanders are younger. They're younger because the United States and NATO went to great lengths to kill off the middle-level commanders. That was the core military policy for the past 20 years. But as a result, they tend to be less aware of the 1990s and the Taliban's mistakes. They tend to be far more technologically sophisticated, but also far more plugged into global jihadi networks. So many of the Taliban of the 1990s were more or less homeboys. Yes, there were segments that came from the Mujahideen that had experience fighting the Soviets and that had experience dealing with external powers like Pakistan and the United States. But if in the 1990s you talked with the Talibs about issues like Israel, let alone some other global jihadi issues beyond, they would have no idea. The current leadership is much more plugged into those networks, has benefited from support, including fundraising support from those networks. It tends to be more modern. The core policy orientation of the Taliban in the 1990s was the rejection, a comprehensive rejection of modernity. Any facet of modernity was seen as a source of evil, as a problem. And the whole objective of the state was the state and the societal relations be made look like they would be in Muhammad's era, centuries and centuries back. That's not necessarily how many of the current military commanders and some of the younger shadow governors, or up till now shadow governors, think about the issue. Modernity in its entirety, it's not a problem. And the Taliban are quite focused on not crashing the economy. They don't want the economy to be shredded. They don't want poverty. They don't want to do away with all banking, all the sort of mantra of the 1990s. But that doesn't mean that they are more open to issues of moderating their views on human rights or women's rights or pluralism. In fact, many of the sheikhs, as the military commanders are referred to, really want an emirate. They really want an emir, as much as they also want to preserve their fiefdom and the economic power and other controls they have within the military. So this contestation between those who sort of understand that they need to relate in some more moderate ways to the international system, as well as to their internal constituencies, as well as to the Afghan polity, and those who are far more rigid will be playing out for a long time. And it will be playing out also in how the international community relates to the Taliban, which brings us back to the issue of recognition and beyond formal recognition. Are there dealings between international actors and the Taliban or not? My view is that if the international community tries to treat Afghanistan in sort of blanket sanctions and isolation, or specifically Taliban with blanket sanctions and isolation, it will actually strengthen the more radical, the more rigid, the more doctrinaire, inward-looking segments of the Taliban and not accomplish more of a moderation of its role.
As we discussed, the idea that responsibilities and obligations may attach to the corporation rather than to the individuals, to what extent is that analogy good with the Taliban? If it's a new group of individuals, does that give us an opportunity perhaps to hold out an incentive that different types of behaviors may result in recognition and perhaps a relaxation of some of the sanctions and other penalties that the international community has brought? And how successful has using recognition as a carrot been in the past?
Well, recognition certainly has been used as a carrot in the past. That's kind of the logic behind the move towards more normative approaches and conditionality that we've really seen in the last half century or so, a little more than a half century, because the whole idea is then, well, we're not going to give you recognition until you comply with human rights. And the record is mixed, I would say. A lot of times you would see maybe some gestures in that direction, maybe something that would have happened anyway, maybe some genuine reforms. You'd have to kind of go case by case. But you saw plenty of cases where there was backsliding, or where, frankly, a given regime was able to just kind of maintain its control on the ground. And eventually the rest of the international community had to kind of give up and say, it's clear they're in control of this country and are going to be for this foreseeable future. And we just have to start dealing with that. That's kind of what happened with the United States and the current Iranian regime. They initially did not recognize them after they came to power, and eventually quietly, actually through a number of court proceedings, were kind of like, yeah, we no longer don't recognize them, and began to kind of tacitly approach recognition, and now pretty much openly acknowledge that they recognize them as the government of Iran. You could see something similar happening here with the Taliban. The trick of that rule, and I think this is part of the problem that all these efforts to condition recognition hang on, is that recognition is just one big binary choice, really, when you get down to it. The actual act of recognition. And once you do it, again, there's a very, very strong incentive to not undo it, because undoing recognition makes every other government you recognize extremely nervous, that you're going to start, stripping them away from the assets. And particularly for the United States, who gets and holds a lot of assets of foreign governments to its benefit, often, particularly given its central role in the global economy, that helps to facilitate. The United States is worried about that. And so they take that particular duty fairly strongly, and I think would be very hesitant to de-recognize a regime without very, very strong, credible reason for doing so. Because of that binary nature, it's hard to install conditionality, because you're never going to be 100% confident to say, okay, everybody's crossed the line now. You're here to good to stay. You're a human rights observer for the rest of time. Time to recognize you now. What you can do, though, is that you can see states provide certain incidents of what would normally normally be attached to recognition without recognizing the regime. So the United States could say, okay, we're going to let representatives from the Taliban come to the United States. We may even let them staff the Afghan embassy at the United States at a low level. We won't accept an ambassador. That's seen as one of these things that only fully recognized governments will do. But perhaps they can send what the Rabbani government did and the Soviet-backed regime before it in the 1990s and 1980s, where they send first secretaries and kind of staff level people, the equivalent of a charge d'affaires ad interim in the U.S. parlance and a lot of other countries' parlance, meaning somebody who's not you don't seek them permission of the host government to send them there, but you're kind of just informing them, yeah, this regular staff person, we've up-jumped to head up this embassy now. You could similarly see them being allowed to represent Afghanistan in certain litigation matters, maybe even use certain assets for certain properties. We've seen that before, where the United States government will say, okay, we're going to release certain assets to this regime because we understand and have credible assurances these assets will be used to pay civil servants or to do something that's clearly a governmental function. And so you can see those little budges, but they're all measures that come before recognition, short of recognition. Once you recognize somebody, the assumption is all those things are going to come. Sanctions, again, is a layer on top of this that's just not that related, really. Sanctions can apply even after recognition takes place, before recognition takes place, is going to cause a problem. Once you recognize the integration between the Afghan institutions and the Taliban become much more complete, and the legal questions become even trickier, but they're already tricky about how much those two things are the same or not in applying sanctions. But sanctions relief is another area where you can see these shades of gray and more targeted incentives be provided that stop short of recognition. In a lot of ways, recognition tends to be the end of the normalization game, or perhaps is best approached as the end of the normalization game, not as an immediate incentive in the short term to say, hey, we want to start getting normalized, so start doing all these things and we're going to recognize you, because it's just a long-term process of that. It actually is like that in the legal standards. Effective control is designed to be applied once you actually have a record to evaluate. It takes time to satisfy that standard inherently. And all the policy measures kind of work the same way, and that's how states usually approach it. It's just not something taken that lightly in circumstances like this.
In the little bit of time that we have remaining, I'll ask the wrap-up question. And Scott, I'll start with you, which is, what do you see as the outlook for a successful Taliban government in Afghanistan? And if you don't see a likely outlook for that, what do you see as the alternative?
It's a really hard question and involves an assessment of a lot of facts that I don't have a firm grasp on. Frankly, I have very strong doubts that anyone has a super firm grasp on. I think the Taliban is the clear favorite to establish a regime that is in effective control of Afghanistan and then ultimately to be recognized. Its clearest route, somewhat ironically, which it is actually recognizes and is actively pursuing as part of that new more cosmopolitan, more aware generation of leadership that Vanda has described, is they are actively trying to get other Afghan factions to join them as kind of minority partners in some sort of unity-ish government. They are also actively saying all the right things about human rights and the treatment of women, even though facts on the ground don't line up with that. So they know what they have to do to get to the point to be recognized. And I suspect that means they also have some patience for that. They know it's going to be a long-term game, and they're going to see some back and forth, and they're going to be engaging in some leverage and negotiations over things like foreign assistance, sanctions relief, and other more immediate items that are much more achievable, and frankly, that particularly in regard to foreign assistance, the international community has an incentive for providing as well, just strictly because of the dire humanitarian need that's going to be very real in Afghanistan very quickly. They seem to be savvy on that track. The harder question, I think, is really in Vanda's area of expertise, which is how cohesive are they as an entity? That's probably the biggest challenge, I think, the biggest question. To what extent can the hand actually control the other hand, or the head actually control the hand in terms of what they're doing? Does the leadership in Doha actually control the people on the ground, not just in Kabul, but in other parts of the country? That's going to be an essential question. If you see Islamic State pop back up, or all of a sudden lots of other groups pop back up and claiming parts of Afghan territory or acting as if they control them, that's going to be a big factor for people to say, look, the Taliban's not the game in town that we care about, or at least not the only one. And not only are we not going to recognize them, they don't even have a good claim to effective control. They don't have a good claim to being recognized in this circumstance. And as long as you see major holdouts, it's going to be hard as well. And I do think that people need to take the Panjshir Valley group that's still existing somewhat seriously in that regard, for the simple reason that so long as they have, and they do appear to have a fairly legitimate claim to that legally to the title, the idea that I am supposed to be the president now of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan that most people think no longer exists, that carries some sway with a lot of crowds that we're already seeing with certain people in Congress. And it's going to complicate the picture for the Taliban from a recognition perspective, so long as they're able to hold out militarily and politically. Again, that may be a reason why the Taliban will even approach them about coming into some sort of power sharing government where the Taliban is still the dominant actor, but they have some sort of role. And I think we've heard some murmurings of some openness to that even potentially down the road. So it depends on how the Taliban plays its game. If it's savvy politically, I think it's got a clear route. It clearly has the upper hand over a lot of other domestic factions right now. And it seems to understand what it's going to need to do internationally to get there. And there is space where it can still have a regime that looks a lot like what it wants and still make progress towards those international benchmarks. Nobody's going to love it on either side, but it's possible. We do have Iran, we do have Saudi Arabia, and these other governments that are recognized, and that's not an issue and fully accepted in the international community. The real question is just whether the Taliban, this generation of the Taliban, the people in control, are up to the task. And it's a tricky question, and I think we just have to wait and see at this point. Although Vanda, frankly, probably knows better than I do.
So Vanda, we'll leave you with the hardest question at the end. What are your thoughts about the outlooks for a successful Taliban government in Afghanistan, or if it is unlikely to be successful, what do you see as the likely state of play?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between successful Taliban regime, surviving Taliban regime, and successful government that rules an Afghan state. Clearly, the last definition of successful Afghan state is the biggest challenge for the Taliban, and frankly, was the challenge that was elusive for the past 20 years. The reason the Taliban is in power is predominantly because governance in Afghanistan had been extraordinarily lousy, has been all about corruption, parochialism, division, self-interest. The Taliban is an insurgency, and even the Taliban in power in the 1990s was actually effective in managing, suppressing some of the most parochial and divisive, self-interested elements that power tempts people to. Will they be able to do it again? Remains to be a question. They have a far tougher challenge. The economic expectation of many of the military commanders, many of the middle-level leadership are quite different. It's no longer just about religious fervor. That on the one hand makes it easier to deal with modernity, but on the other hand, it pushes up those issues of divisions and, frankly, parochial self-interest. Inclusiveness will be an important dimension. I frankly really don't put that much stock in the negotiations with Abdullah, Hamid Karzai, and Hekmatyar. They are expression of how divisive and exclusionary the prior government was in many ways. The broader issue, and they're also the face of corruption and mismanagement and misgovernance. So for the Taliban to bring in Hamid Karzai, it's like saying, well, the man whom we accused of being one of the key thieves is now part of our fiefdom. The bigger question to me is, will they be able to bring in sufficiently large number of certainly Tajiks, perhaps some Panshiris? I don't imagine that Amrullah Saleh would be the man they would bring into the government, but will they be able to bring in other Panshiris, other Andarabis? They already have their own commanders who come from some of those ethnic minorities, but will they be able to reach beyond themselves? And then the question is, will they be able to manage the economy, both not to end up in conditions of massive famine that bring revolutionary movements down, even revolutionary movements who've come to power, think Al-Shabaab in 2011, but will they also manage the economy enough to be able to be given all the different power brokers, all the different militias at the local and national level, enough of a stake? So Scott talked earlier about how in the United States, we buy into the system because we believe that the system is legitimate and because we can channel our differences about policy and preferences and governance through institutional avenues. In Afghanistan, systems persist if there is enough pie to divide. And if the Taliban doesn't handle that well, it will not have enough money to maintain their own commanders, their own middle-level leaderships but also the very many with whom it made deals in the past 2 months. The part of the Blitzkrieg was not only that the Afghan security forces folded, but that the Taliban was very adroitly negotiating with many militias, many local communities, and national level power brokers, including some of those whose names have been mentioned here, and promising them that they will maintain access to local rents. And to maintain that success, they will need to deliver on the promise, both because they will not be so possessive and so exclusionary, but because the local rents will persist.
So thank you very much. We've been joined by Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown and by Scott R. Anderson, both of the Brookings Institution, to discuss the outlook for the future of Afghanistan, which seems to be troubled and troubling. And yet there is perhaps a path ahead, even if it is not one that is normatively the one that we would choose or the one that the United States and NATO fought for over the last 20 years. Vanda, Scott, thank you both very much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.